Welcome to the bottom of the rabbit hole. Salute to you for coming through. You are very much appreciated. Please be sure to like the video, and if this is your first time down here, subscribe, check the notification bell, and stay tuned to yellow-pilled Matrix content. Today, we're going to solve the Matrix battery problem once and for all. This is one of those movie topics that I usually just write off because, contrary to popular belief, The Matrix is not a documentary. It is listed under science fiction. Yet some people will have you believe in the late 90s the idea of a human being used as a battery was a concept that was suddenly too far-fetched for a science fiction movie. For me personally, this subject is not that serious, based on the fact the genre listing of the film is accurate. But that wouldn't be a Matrixology video if I just stopped there. So in the spirit of a yellow-pilled approach, let's dig a little deeper. If you haven't already seen the Animatrix, I highly suggest you watch at least the second Renaissance episodes. Both are in the Animatrix playlist here on this channel, and I'll put links in the description box as well. Let's start with how Morpheus defined the human battery in the first Matrix film.
We don't know who struck first, us or them, but we know that it was us that scorched the sky. At the time, they were dependent on solar power, and it was believed that they would be unable to survive without an energy source as abundant as the sun. The human body generates more bioelectricity than a 120-volt battery and over 25,000 BTUs of body heat. Combined with a form of fusion, the machines had found all the energy they would ever need. The Matrix is a computer-generated dream world, built to keep us under control in order to change a human being into this.
Morpheus says the human body generates more bioelectricity than a 120-volt battery, but that doesn't really tell us how much power we are truly dealing with, because we do not know the current or amps of the 120-volt battery he's talking about. In order to determine a measurement of power, one has to apply Watt's law formula. Power equals current times voltage, or watts equals amps times volts. So since we don't know the amps in this equation, we don't really have a basis for comparison to this particular 120-volt battery. But we do know, in the case of very short bursts of energy, some humans can output up to 2,000 watts. A quick side note, I am aware of the story that the original script had a different idea for the description of humans being plugged into the Matrix. The story goes something like the Wachowskis originally wrote that humans were plugged into a network that was more blockchain-like in nature to generate more computer processing power as opposed to them being copper-top batteries. But there was some pushback from the studio saying the concept was too complicated for audiences. I can't verify how much of that rumor is true, but I was able to dig up the 1996 version of the script, and here's what was cut out from what Morpheus said in the 1999 version of the film. We are, as an energy source, easily renewable and completely recyclable. The dead liquefied and fed intravenously to the living. All they needed to control this new battery was something to occupy our mind. And so they built a prison out of our past, wired it to our brains, and turned us into slaves. So you can see there, they still use the word battery. Also notice that in neither version does Morpheus ever use the phrase nuclear fusion. But what I think is more important here is the use of the words prison and slaves. We'll come back to that later, because right now I want you to remember Morpheus saying, we don't know who struck first. Those of us who watched the Animatrix do know who struck first. Yet the fact that Morpheus does not know this part of his history tells us that the information Morpheus has is still rooted within the existing systems of control.
The function of the one is now to return to the source, allowing a temporary dissemination of the code you carry, reinserting the prime program. After which you will be required to select from the Matrix 23 individuals, 16 female, 7 male, to rebuild Zion.
It is completely possible that Morpheus does not really know what he's talking about. Most of the information they have is sanctioned by the Oracle, who is a part of the system. In fact, at no point in the film does Morpheus even find out that the Oracle is a part of the system of control. So in order to truly define the applications of this technology, let's check out how his description lines up with the machine archive in the Animatrix.
Victorious, the machines now turned to the vanquished. Applying what they had learned about their enemy, the machines turned to an alternate and readily available power supply, the bioelectric, thermal, and kinetic energies of the human body. A newly refashioned symbiotic relationship between the two adversaries was born. The machine, drawing power from the human body, an endlessly multiplying, infinitely renewable energy source.
So again, we have yet another definition that never uses the word nuclear. The words that were used were bioelectric, thermal, and kinetic. Now, this next footnote is often overlooked in the Matrix universe. We know that Morpheus gets all his information from Zion, and if you notice, at the beginning of the second Renaissance episodes in the Animatrix, the narrator states that it is a Zion archive. The thing is, I told you to remember, Morpheus also tells us he doesn't know who struck first, and yet the Zion Machine Archive tells us exactly who struck first, the why, and how the situation developed. We know from the architect that Zion was given to the humans by the machines, and during the Dark Storm clip, the man speaking on the UN floor says Operation Dark Storm will destabilize Zion. So not only does this confirm that the machines themselves once occupied Zion, I believe that it also suggests the main power source within Zion is geothermic heat. Tank tells us in the first Matrix film that the last human city is near the Earth's core, where it is still warm. So for anyone who asks, why didn't the machines use geothermic heat? Well, they did. They used it immediately after the sun was taken away to power the underground city of Zion during the war. So we now know solar power is not an option, and geothermic heat is already being utilized by the city of Zion. Bender asks, why not use a potato or a battery? Well, a potato battery is an electrical chemical cell where the chemicals zinc and copper react with each other, which produces chemical energy. The chemical energy is converted to electric energy by a spontaneous electron transfer. While this electrical energy can power a small device like an LED light or clock, each raw potato only produces about 0.5 volts of energy at 0.2 milliamps, which is not very much, and potatoes only last about 2 to 5 days. An adult in good shape has a much longer shelf life and can average 50 to 100 watts for an hour of vigorous exercise, and up to 500 watts in body heat alone. The potato battery simply is not the better alternative it was advertised to be. So why not cows or some other animal, less likely to resist the system? We don't know the extent of the nuclear fallout from the war itself, so there simply could be no other DNA samples from large animals to draw from. But the real answer to this question is that they never said there wasn't an alternative power source of some kind.
Failure to comply with this process will result in a cataclysmic system crash, killing everyone connected to the Matrix, which, coupled with the extermination of Zion, will ultimately result in the extinction of the entire human race.
You won't let it happen. You can't. You need human beings to survive.
There are levels of survival we are prepared to accept. However, the relevant issue is whether or not you are ready to accept the responsibility for the death of every human being in this world.
The architect tells us that even with a complete Matrix system crash, he did not plan on turning all the lights off. The machines surely had other options, perhaps geothermic, or maybe a secret stash of backup cow DNA. But please do not miss that the architect had no problem with trying to hold the threat of Neo being responsible for ending the entire human race if Neo allowed the Matrix to crash instead of resetting it. Using humans as a power source is an insurance policy based on leverage. This is a hostage situation. Now remember that Morpheus used the word prison in the original description of the human battery. In part 2 of the second Renaissance episode, we are told that the machine studied the human anatomy to inflict more damage and pain during the war. So these particular intelligent machines weren't in the business of studying cows. These machines were not at war with Big Dairy. The machines won the war against mankind. Humanity blocked out the sun in a failed attempt to starve the machines, and so the machines in turn robbed mankind of its flesh. The machines were victorious, and the choice to use human batteries does not have to be the most practical option. It was a prison industrial complex solution. It was a punishment. It's slavery. The more common complaint, though, is that a human battery would take more energy to keep humans alive than the energy that they would produce. This idea is that the human battery concept violates the laws of thermodynamics. I often see people say, you can't get out more than you put in. So let's take a closer look at the 3 laws of thermodynamics. The first law, the law of conservation of energy, states that energy cannot be created or destroyed in an isolated system. The second law of thermodynamics states that the entropy of any isolated system always increases. The third law of thermodynamics states that the entropy of a system approaches a constant value as the temperature approaches absolute zero. The term entropy can be confusing, so there's a link in the description to a video that explains the definition in better detail. A quick definition of entropy is a measure of each energy configuration's probability, or in other words, a measure of how spread out the energy is. Higher entropy is always statistically more likely. If energy has the opportunity to spread out, it will. The energy output is at its highest when it's clumped together. Once the energy is completely spread out, you can't use it anymore. So from a mechanical engineering perspective, this makes sense. It's a mathematical law used for the prevention of errors. Critical errors, similar to the matrix having an anomaly it can't quite fix. What is impossible here is the reversal of the entropy only increases rule of thermodynamics. Nowhere in the Matrix trilogy do they claim the battery technology can reverse entropy spontaneously, or that it can reverse entropy for the entire universe. In fact, the architect defines Neo as the error or remainder of his equation, without which the system crashes completely, much like an engineer who builds a machine that violates these rules. Ultimately, it will fail. And I believe a big problem with this subject is that people often think of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics as only the arrow of time, or a constraint used for the prevention of errors from the scope of the entirety of the universe. Whereas a positron, which is the antimatter equivalent to an electron, can be viewed as an electron moving backward in time. If the conditions allow an extremely low entropy state at the very start, there is more room for the entropy to increase, and therefore more potential energy to utilize. In the Matrix, Morpheus uses the word combined and the word fusion. In the Animatrix, she says bioelectric, thermal, and kinetic energies. So the formula for kinetic energy is 1/2 mv squared, or half the mass times the velocity squared. And because the velocity is squared, that means the speed has much more importance than the mass with regard to the kinetic energy output. The larger the mass, the more energy is required. So if I were a super intelligent machine in the future, I'd be looking for something really small that moves really fast. Each neuron in the brain possesses the ability to accumulate a charge across its cell membrane, which results in a small but meaningful voltage. A single neuron has an average resting voltage of 0.07 volts. And there just happens to be approximately 80 billion neurons in the average human brain. We know the voltage across a neuron's membrane is 0.07 or 70 millivolts, and the average thickness of the membrane is 5 nanometers. That equals 14 million volts per meter. which is over 4 times the electrostatic force required to produce lightning in a natural thunderstorm. That's a whole lot of electrostatic juice that already exists within the rules of thermodynamics. Talk about mind over matter. But physics theory aside, the bulk of human energy is required for important tasks such as pumping your heart and flexing your muscles, but a lot of it is wasted, primarily as heat, but also through other physical inefficiencies. Almost all of this wasted energy could be captured and turned into electricity. In the matrix pods, movement is simulated, so that energy can be transferred. The only reason such energy harvesting techniques aren't widely used is the immaturity of the technology. While it is easy to capture body heat on a grand scale, such as towers filled with millions of people in pods, there's still no easy way to harvest large amounts of waste heat on a local scale. The machines of tomorrow could develop techniques to utilize this energy without violating physics. Rest assured, human batteries are coming. It's just a matter of time and research. Apologies for the physics lecture, but I had to prove the human battery described in the Matrix universe is not anywhere near as impossible as some would have you believe. And even though trying to break down details might be as complicated as explaining how a microwave works to a colonial times George Washington, I'd like to imagine that Ben Franklin would have been all over this kind of conversation. In the real world, a human battery may still be considered an inefficient process today, but the science has the potential to be exponentially more efficient in the future. Or as Bender put it,
good work, writer of the Matrix!
And remember, as one realizes that one is a dream figure in another person's dream, that is self-awareness.